Alright. Hey, I'm Aqua or Aquarius of Fallen Snow if you don't know me. Welcome to another video on my channel. If you've been here before, welcome back. Happy to have you back with us again. So in this video, we're going to be looking at Judith Thomson's violinist argument, which is a continuation basically to the podcast I posted recently with Anna, which was the pro-life versus pro-choice conversation. And I think this is an important point to bring up, or an important thought experiment to mention as part of that conversation, right? So I have a bit of a script written up to make it easier to explain and break down. So I'm going to pull that up now and read through it, and then maybe give some of my own thoughts at the end. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Today, we're diving into a thought experiment that has become a cornerstone of the philosophical discussion surrounding abortion and the broader pro-life versus pro-choice debate. Today, we're talking about Judith Jarvis Thomson's famous violinist argument. First off, let's briefly recap what is the pro-life versus pro-choice debate in general. At its heart, it centers on the moral and legal status of a fetus and the extent to which a pregnant person has the right to make decisions about their own body, including the decisions to continue or terminate a pregnancy. But let's quickly look at each side. Generally, those who identify as pro-life hold that the human life begins at conception and therefore a fetus has the right to life. This perspective often argues that abortion is morally wrong because it constitutes the taking of a human life. Conversely, those who identify as pro-choice emphasize a pregnant person's bodily autonomy, the right to control what happens to their own body. This perspective often argues that the decision to continue or terminate a pregnancy is a fundamental right of the pregnant person. Now, into this complex landscape steps Judith Thomson with her thought-provoking violinist argument, first presented in her 1971 essay, A Defense of Abortion. It's crucial to understand that Thomson doesn't necessarily take a stance on when a fetus becomes a person with a right to life in the traditional sense. Instead, she grants, for the sake of argument, that a fetus might indeed have a right to life very early on. However, she then uses the violinist analogy to argue that even if a fetus has a right to life, it doesn't automatically follow that a pregnant person has an obligation to sustain that life by carrying the pregnancy to term. But let's dive into the thought experiment now. Imagine you wake up one morning and find yourself surgically connected to a famous unconscious violinist. This violinist has a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has kidnapped you because you have the right blood type. You are now the only person who can save the violinist's life. They've connected your circulatory system to his, and if you are disconnected, the violinist will die. The good news is that in 9 months, the violinist will recover and can be safely disconnected from you. The bad news is that for those 9 months, you are effectively bedridden. Your body is being used to keep another person alive, and you didn't consent to this situation. Thomson then asks, do you have a moral obligation to remain connected to the violinist for 9 months, even though it drastically impacts your own life? Most people intuitively answer no. You might feel sympathy for the violinist, and it would be a kind act to stay connected, but Thomson argues that you are not morally obligated to sacrifice your bodily autonomy for his life. Now, let's consider some arguments made from the pro-life perspective in response to Thomson's violinist analogy. These arguments often focus on the differences they see between the analogy and the actual pregnancy. Pro-life arguments often emphasize the unique relationship between a pregnant person and their fetus, arguing that it's fundamentally different from being kidnapped and connected to a stranger. They might point out the fact that the fetus is biologically related to the pregnant person. Thomson addresses this in her essay, suggesting a scenario where you willingly open your window and there is a risk of seeds drifting in and taking root in your carpet. Even though you allow the possibility, you're still not obligated to let a fully grown oak tree take over your living room. Some pro-life arguments highlight that many pregnancies result from consensual sexual intercourse, suggesting a degree of responsibility or implied consent to the potential outcome of pregnancy. Thomson counters this by distinguishing between voluntary undertaking, something like inviting a guest into your house, and voluntarily giving someone the right to use your body, like donating an organ. She argues that consensual sex doesn't automatically grant a fetus the right to use the pregnant person's body. Other perspectives sometimes argue that disconnecting from the violinist is a passive act of allowing death, whereas abortion is a direct and intentional act of ending a life. Thomson challenges this by arguing that in both cases you are withdrawing your life-sustaining support, and the intention is to regain control over your own body. Another key pro-life argument is that while the violinist has a right to life, that right doesn't extend to the right to use another person's body to sustain that life. However, pro-lifers often argue that the pregnant person has a prior moral obligation to care for their dependent offspring. It's important to note that Thomson's argument is primarily about the right to not be used by another person, even if that person has a right to life. She is not necessarily arguing about the moral status of the fetus itself. Her argument is a powerful way to challenge the direct inference from a fetus has the right to life to abortion is always morally wrong. The violinist argument remains a crucial and often debated thought experiment in bioethics and the philosophy of law. It forces us to think critically about the concepts of rights, obligations, and bodily autonomy in the context of pregnancy. While it doesn't resolve the pro-life versus pro-choice debate, it offers a compelling philosophical lens through which to examine the moral permissibility of abortion in certain circumstances. What do you think about the violinist argument? Does the analogy hold up for you? What are some of the strongest arguments you've heard on either side in response to it, or in terms of the pro-life versus pro-choice conversation? And that's basically the end of what I had written and help with from AI, but I'd like to give some of my own thoughts on it now, right? At the start of the podcast, I added in the intro that I feel like now some of my thoughts align on both sides of the conversation, especially in the sense that when I think about what I've been saying in terms of trying to take a more egalitarian and pacifist point of view and embrace those practices in my own life, I feel like they align with both sides in the sense of I feel like pacifism aligns more with the pro-life side and egalitarianism aligns more with the pro-choice side, right? So basically, since having that conversation, it's opened my eyes more to the fact that, yeah, there are different points of view, especially when it comes down to morality. And I think it would be good for me to do a video specifically looking into moral objectivity versus subjectivity, because that's basically the conversation of are morals something that should be, enforced societally or to a level where everybody's on the same page, or is it more subjective to the point where people kind of choose what is morally right and wrong to them, And I feel like if we could get to a point where everybody subjectively has their own set of moral standards, and then we can accumulate those subjective ones to make more objective ones, I think it would make sense, and that would also lead to the justice system and law, right? Obviously, that has its own troubles and corruptions with money and with people's egos and ignorance when it comes to judges or cops or whoever it is, We obviously have to bring that point up as well, right? But in my opinion, I think it really comes down to, can the mother take care of the child, either physically and emotionally, financially, whatever it is? Because if she can't, or she doesn't want to because the conception of that child was traumatic or against her will, then I think it's completely in her right to choose whether to have an abortion or not, right? Unfortunately, it does take away the life of the potential child or person that would grow up, but we have to understand that Although we can try to take an idealist point of view and hope that the best outcome is always going to happen, we also have to look at the reality of situations and say sometimes it is traumatic events, sometimes it is against people's will, and sometimes people just aren't able to take care of a child at the time of conception. Maybe that's even worth asking, should we have more support in place for these situations, right? In the podcast episode I did with Anna, which I'll make sure is linked under the eye icon as well as in the description below, she made a good point that it can also be traumatic to go through an abortion, and it can actually cause more damage to the mother's body, and how going through pregnancy can actually help heal a mother's body. So I guess there is a potential argument on the other side, on the pro-life side, to say that that pregnancy could somewhat help heal the mother from whatever traumatic event or experience she went through in the first place, right? And then if she is provided with additional financial support or therapeutic support and health support, I think it's totally possible that it could change people's opinion or point of view on continuing the pregnancy till term, right? Obviously, it's not my place as a man or as a person in general to tell anybody how to live their life, but I think this is definitely an interesting conversation and an important one to have with both respect and nuance, right? I'm going to have a video coming out soon, but probably after this one, about conversationalism, which is about the idea of thesis and antithesis, basically the yin and yang of conversation. And I think this perfectly fits into that, and I might even add a section about this conversation to that video. But since I've already recorded a few videos today, I think I'm going to leave it here for now, and if I have more ideas that I want to add to this topic, I'll definitely make more videos in the future on it. I hope to also have Anna back on the channel to record more conversations about this topic and about good and evil, religion, faith, spirituality, philosophy, all of it, right? So stay tuned for that. Make sure to drop a follow, not only to help us build the community, but then you never miss a new video, especially if you hit the bell icon. But yeah, like I said, I'll leave this one here for now. I might pick it up again in the future, who knows? But like I say in all my videos, I love you, stay safe, good luck, and take it easy.